Okay, so we all have this general picture of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq, right? The wars, the oppression, it's widely known.
Yeah, definitely. It's part of recent history.
But what really underpinned his power? What was the chilling foundation of that dictatorship?
That's the key question.
Today we're doing a deep dive into maybe the darkest part, his torture chambers. It's one thing to say a leader was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
It's another to really look at the machinery of that brutality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while let's say the headlines of his reign are familiar, looking closely at the torture system itself gives you this really stark, really disturbing insight into how he kept that absolute control for so long.
It wasn't just about armies and tanks then.
No, not at all. It was this deliberate, systematic campaign using pain, using terror.
So that's our focus for this deep dive. Saddam Hussein's network of torture chambers and just the sheer brutality that marked his rule from 1979 to 2003. We're working from some detailed accounts here that really expose this horrific side.
And it's important to grasp who we're talking about. Saddam was a dictator. He knew his power rested on eliminating anyone he saw as a threat.
Right.
Fear wasn't just like a byproduct, it was the foundation. And torture was absolutely central to building that foundation.
So our goal today isn't just listing awful things. It's trying to understand the methods, the motivations behind them, and the impact that still felt. We want to get beyond just the headlines,
Exactly. To understand the inner workings, grim as they are.
Okay, let's unpack this. Saddam's rise to absolute power in 1979. The source material suggests this wasn't overnight.
No, definitely not. It was a gradual consolidation over years leading up to that official takeover.
Right.
But even early on, the details we have point to this. Deep obsession with control. It wasn't just governing.
It was domination.
A little domination, yeah. And that showed itself immediately in getting rid of any potential rivals, any dissent. This early focus, it really set the stage for torture becoming institutionalized, a core tool.
Which leads us straight to this architecture of fear, as it's described. This network of torture chambers across Iraq. Not just a couple of secret jails, then.
Oh, far from it. It was an extensive network spread right across the country. And what's really unsettling, looking at the details, is how they hid them.
How so?
Well, they were put in, unassuming buildings, inside military bases, even, incredibly, in underground facilities beneath presidential palaces.
Beneath palaces? Wow.
Yeah. It points to this calculated, widespread effort to create hidden spaces where these horrific acts could happen systematically, out of sight.
The account names some infamous spots. Abu Ghraib is one, a name that sadly becomes notorious again later.
Tragically so.
Then there's the Radwania Palace Complex, specifically mentioning underground facilities there. That's chilling.
It is. And Al-Nasiriyah Detention Center, noted for just terrible overcrowding and brutal treatment.
These weren't just prisons for holding people, were they? The design itself was part of the terror.
No, absolutely not. The design, as the details show, was meant to break people. Soundproof walls for total isolation. Iron restraints to make victims completely helpless. The tools themselves, the instruments of torture, were chosen for maximum pain, maximum psychological damage.
This wasn't random cruelty.
No, it was planned, systematic, designed to dismantle a person.
And the methods. The account is explicit. Physical torture like beatings with metal rods, electrocution.
Agonizing methods.
And even acid baths. It's almost unthinkable.
And it's crucial to get this. The goal wasn't just physical pain. The psychological torture was just as important, maybe more so, for the regime's aims.
Like what?
Things like threats against family members, terrifying leverage, prolonged isolation, which can just shatter your sense of reality yourself, mock executions. Pure terror.
So it wasn't only about breaking the person in the cell.
Exactly. It was about terrorizing their family, their community, silencing anyone who might even think about opposing the regime.
And the source brings up another horrific layer. The systematic use of sexual violence against men and women detainees.
Yes. And in these situations, that kind of violence, it's not just physical. It's an attack on someone's core identity, their dignity.
A tool for humiliation.
Profound humiliation, yes. To strip away self-worth, to break individuals and communities through shame and fear. It's utterly depraved.
The account also mentions grotesque public displays, dismemberment, public executions. This wasn't just punishment, was it? It was theater. A horrible kind of theater.
Precisely. It was a constant, brutal warning. See what happens if you defy us. It was about embedding fear so deep that resistance becomes unthinkable. The most visceral, shocking displays possible.
There are some survivor accounts concluded. They really pulled this out of historical texts and into real human suffering. Someone locked in a flooded cell, forced to stand for days, guards mocking them. That image.
It stays with you. And the detail about prisoners being mutilated, having their ears cut off as a warning.
Just barbaric.
These aren't isolated cruelties. They show a calculated system of extreme violence meant to control absolutely. These specific personal stories, they make the scale of it, the human cost, devastatingly real.
So who ended up in these places? Who were the victims? It wasn't just high-profile enemies, was it? The net seems incredibly wide.
It was. Anyone seen as a potential threat. Political opponents, obviously the account specifically mentions Kurdish and Shia communities who suffered terribly.
Systematically targeted.
Yes, but it went much further. Intellectuals, activists, writers, journalists, academics, anyone who might question the narrative.
A dissenting voice was dangerous.
Extremely. And tragically, ordinary people too.
Yeah.
Caught up in raids, often just based on suspicion. You get this picture of a society just drenched in fear.
Yeah.
Fear of the knock on the door.
That constant threat.
Exactly. The text highlights the Anfal campaign against the Kurds in the late 80s. Mass detentions, torture, executions, whole villages wiped out. It shows the regime's willingness for massive collective punishment.
And the ones carrying this out day to day, Saddam's secret police, the Mukhabarat, what was their role exactly?
They were the engine of this fear machine. The eyes, the ears, often the hands.
Right.
Their job was identifying these so-called enemies of the state. They had vast networks of surveillance, informants everywhere.
So they'd identify people.
And then they'd apprehend them.
Yeah.
And they were directly involved in the brutal interrogations inside the torture chambers. They were the core operators, the whole system.
So digging into the motivations, why this level of extreme brutality, just crushing opposition seems... Well, this went beyond that, didn't it?
It did. Suppressing opposition, consolidating his own absolute power. Those key drivers, absolutely. The account makes that clear. But there was also this deliberate strategy. Instill widespread, paralyzing fear in everyone. The public violence, the constant threat of torture. It was all designed to create a society where dissent wasn't just risky, it was almost unthinkable.
Eradicate the very idea of resistance.
That seems to have been the goal.
Now, something else the source raises, which is deeply troubling, is international awareness. It seems these abuses weren't entirely secret.
No, the evidence was there. Reports, testimonies.
Yet, the account points out that during the Iran-Iraq War, many Western powers actually supported Iraq.
Geopolitics.
And the reaction to things like the chemical weapon attacks on the Kurds was muted, is the word used.
It forces a difficult look at historical complicity, doesn't it?
It really does. That balance between national interests and basic human rights.
Yeah, and the text suggests that muted international response basically allowed these atrocities to go on longer, unchecked. It's a stark reminder of how complex and sometimes contradictory international relations can be when facing these horrors.
Then comes 2003, the fall of the regime, and the floodgates opened, didn't they?
They did. Survivor testimonies poured out. Mass graves were discovered. The sheer scale of it became undeniable.
Horrifying confirmation.
And the account really stresses that the legacy of these torture chambers, it's not over. It deeply affects Iraq today.
Oh, so.
The trauma. For survivors, for the families of victims, it doesn't just disappear when the dictator falls. It gets woven into the collective memory, healing, reconciliation. That's a long, incredibly difficult process after such widespread systematic brutality. The psychological scars run incredibly deep.
So pulling this all together, this deep dive into the source material shows Saddam's torture chambers weren't just some grim side aspect. They were central, meticulously organized, part of a regime built entirely on fear and absolute control.
Yeah, a terrifying example of what unchecked power can lead to.
And for you, listening, hopefully, in seeking to understand this dark period, this deep dive has offered a more profound and, yes, disturbing picture of a reality we really shouldn't forget.
Definitely shouldn't forget.
It certainly has for me. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What are the truly long-term effects of that kind of systematic brutality on a whole society? What are the challenges for healing, for reconciliation after that kind of mass trauma?
Huge questions.
It really makes you reflect on why vigilance against tyranny in all its forms is so crucial, and why protecting basic human rights has to be paramount, learning even from the darkest chapters. Okay, let's dive into this. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. I mean, the name itself, it just brings up so much, doesn't it? Devotion, despotism.
Absolutely. Revolution and, well, repression, too, is quite the contrast. And that 1979 Iranian Revolution, he led it, completely changed the game. Monarchy out, Islamic Republic in. A huge shift for the whole Middle East.
Oh, right. So what we want to do in this deep dive is really get into the different facets of his life. From, the religious scholar beginnings all the way to supreme leader.
Exactly. And the sources we're looking at, they really cover the whole sweep. His early years, how he started opposing the Shah, that long exile, the revolution itself.
And then the really tough part, consolidating power, the purges, the human rights issues, all of that.
Yeah. So our mission, if you like, is to try and understand how he rose to power, the key moments, and also grapple with those controversies around his rule. Pull out the most important insights.
Okay, so where do we start? Back in Khomeini, 1902, his birth.
Right. And everything points to a deeply, deeply religious upbringing from day one.
And his father died early on, didn't he? Which seems to have just, pushed him even further into Islamic studies.
It seems so. He apparently mastered theology, philosophy, really immersed himself.
But here's what's interesting, based on the readings. His writings weren't just like old school religious texts. They started blending traditional Islamic thought with these, revolutionary ideas.
That's a key point, isn't it? That combination. It wasn't just standard theology. It had this political edge, even early on.
Yeah, it's like you can see the seeds being planted for challenging the whole system later on, but from a religious angle.
Definitely. Which brings us to the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, mid-20th century Iran.
Yeah, our sources paint a picture of, heavy Western influence, lots of modernization efforts.
But also the Savak, the secret police. Pretty brutal suppression of anyone who disagreed.
Right, and that's the backdrop for Khomeini really starting to speak out. He zeroed in on the Shah's secular policies, didn't he? And those close ties to the West.
Especially the U.S., yeah. He was very critical of that relationship.
And then 1963 seems like a massive turning point. Those speeches he gave against the Shah's white revolution.
Things like land reform, giving women the vote. Khomeini saw these as attacking tradition.
It wasn't just quiet disagreement either, was it? It was public, a direct challenge.
A very direct challenge. And why those specific reforms? Well, it looks like he, and many others, saw them as basically forcing Western secularism onto Iran, undermining their Islamic identity.
And the Shah's response, arresting him, which, looking back, seems like a huge mistake.
Totally backfired.
Yeah.
Our sources say it just sparked these massive protests all over.
And suddenly Khomeini wasn't just a cleric anymore. He was this national figure, fearless opponent of the regime.
That arrest, even though it wasn't super long, it really cemented that image. Made him almost a martyr figure for a lot of people.
And it set the stage for his exile, right? 14 years, mostly in Iraq.
Mostly Iraq, then a stint in France towards the end.
Yeah.
A long time away.
And during that exile, that's when his big idea, the Velayat-e Faqih, that really took shape.
Exactly. Guardianship of the Islamic jurist. This became the blueprint, really, the ideological foundation for the Islamic Republic he envisioned.
Can you break that down a bit? What does it actually mean?
Well, essentially it's the principle that the highest religious authorities, the Islamic jurists or faqiehs, should have the ultimate political authority in the state. They're the guardians.
Okay, so rule by the clerics, basically.
In essence, yes. And what's pretty amazing is how he got these ideas out there while he was stuck in exile.
The tapes. Our sources mention smuggled cassette tapes with his sermons.
Yeah, those tapes and his writings. They apparently spread like wildfire inside Iran, really fueling the revolutionary movement. You can just imagine people secretly listening to these messages.
Incredible. And it wasn't just his ideas, was it? Things were getting pretty bad under the Shah anyway.
Oh, definitely. The sources point to, economic problems, people feeling politically shut down, this sense that traditional Iranian culture was being washed away by Western stuff.
So the ground was fertile, so to speak.
Very fertile. And Khomeini became the symbol everyone could rally around, even groups that didn't fully agree on everything else. He was the face of the opposition.
Which leads to that incredible moment in February 1979, the Shah flees.
And Khomeini returns, triumphant. The sources describe these absolutely massive crowds, just pure jubilation.
It really cemented his status, didn't it? Father of the revolution.
No question. He wasn't just a religious leader anymore. He was the revolution in the eyes of millions.
But then the story takes a much darker turn, according to our sources.
Yeah, it does. That figure who united so many people. Once he actually had power, things changed. A much more authoritarian streak emerged pretty quickly.
Within months, really. Purges starting, rivals being eliminated, executions.
It's a pattern you see sometimes, unfortunately. The pressure cooker of revolution can lead to this intolerance. Suppressing dissent becomes seen as, like, necessary for survival.
And the sources give some really grim examples. That cultural revolution in the early 80s.
Right. Shutting down universities, trying to purge Western or un-Islamic ideas.
And the cost for academics, for students, arrests, dismissals, even executions. It's chilling.
Then there was the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis. That whole ordeal
Lasted 444 days. And Khomeini explicitly backed the students who seized it.
He did. It certainly boosted his anti-Western credentials, standing up to the Great Satan, as he called the U.S.
But the international fallout, huge. It isolated Iran for years, decades even.
Absolutely. And internally, the crackdown wasn't just on abstract ideas. Ethnic minorities, like the Kurds, faced brutal suppression.
And political opponents, too. Leftists, monarchists, even people who'd initially supported the revolution but then disagreed.
Yeah, the scale of the imprisonments and executions in those early years is, well, it's quite staggering when you look at the numbers.
And we haven't even touched on the Iran-Iraq war yet. 8 years.
It's hearted by Saddam Hussein's invasion, yes, but Khomeini refused early chances for peace. He prolonged it.
At immense cost, over 1 million dead, maybe more.
Horrific numbers. And his view of it, calling the war a blessing, a test for the Islamic Republic. It shows a real ruthlessness, ideology over human life.
It's hard to fathom. And then towards the end of the war, those 1988 mass executions.
Yeah, that's a particularly dark chapter. Khomeini issues a fatwa, a religious ruling.
And thousands of political prisoners, mostly leftists and MEK members, are just systematically executed.
Our sources are clear. This is widely seen as a real low point, a brutal consolidation of power against any remaining internal opposition.
So putting it all together, it's no wonder his legacy is so incredibly polarizing.
Not at all. He died in 1989, but the debate rages on. Was he the hero who freed Iran?
Or a tyrant who just swapped one dictatorship for another, maybe even a harsher one.
Exactly. Supporters see the liberation from the West, the championing of Islam. Critics see the executions, the repression, the war.
And the system he built, Vilayat Fakhari, it's still the bedrock of Iranian politics today, right? The supreme leader has the final say.
That's right. The structure endures. And those questions about human rights, about authoritarianism, they haven't gone away. They're still major issues.
Our sources also touch on some murkier areas, things less clear-cut, these shadowed secrets.
Yeah, like the role of outside powers. There's still debate. Wasn't there some level of, maybe not help, but encouragement from certain foreign powers during the Shah's fall, hoping Khomeini might be, I don't know, manageable?
It's a persistent question. How much did external factors play into his consolidation of power? Hard to know for sure.
And then there are those rumors, always swirling, about his family, allegations of wealth accumulation.
Which clashes pretty hard with the image he cultivated, right? The simple, austere lifestyle.
It does create a dissonance, though proving those kinds of rumors definitively is, well, tricky.
Also, some declassified documents apparently show there were internal disagreements, even among the top clerics, about Khomeini's interpretations, his methods.
It wasn't necessarily a monolithic bloc, even at the highest levels. Suggests internal power struggles and debates over the direction of the revolution. It reminds you that history is rarely simple.
So when you zoom out, look at the whole picture. Ayatollah Khomeini's impact is just immense, undeniable on Iran, on the entire region. History was definitely changed.
Profoundly. And that core tension we keep coming back to, it's right there in his legacy, this powerful revolutionary energy.
Existing side by side with these incredibly ruthless methods used to keep control.
Yeah. It really forces you to think about the complexities, the often uncomfortable truths about revolutions and the leaders they produce.
Which kind of leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. How do we square those inspiring revolutionary ideals that can motivate so many with the potential for absolute power corrupting the leaders of those movements?
And what do all these ambiguities, these debated secrets surrounding someone like Khomeini, tell us about how difficult it truly is to get a complete picture of the past, especially when figures are so polarizing?
We all see the headlines coming out of Saudi Arabia, don't we? You know, the massive wealth, these really ambitious projects, lots of talk about reform.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what's really going on beneath that very, very carefully managed image? That's what we want to explore today.
Exactly. We're going to, try and dig a bit deeper into some of the let's say, less publicized aspects of the House of Saud, maybe some more unsettling things. We're drawing on various articles and reports here, trying to peel back some layers, look at the controversies, the secrets that, don't always make the front page.
Okay, great. So maybe the place to start is, well, the beginning. This immense power didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it? There's a long history here.
Oh, definitely not overnight. The roots of the House of Saud, they stretch back to the 18th century, though their influence has sort of waxed and waned over time.
Right.
But the kingdom, as we recognize it today, that really came together in 1932, unified by King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And what's really key is how he established the foundation for absolute rule. It's partly about, smart tribal alliances, but also, very importantly, establishing religious legitimacy.
And that religious angle, that ties into the alliance with the Wahhabi movement, doesn't it? That wasn't just like a side deal.
No, not at all. That pact was absolutely fundamental. Wahhabism started as this very puritanical Islamic reform movement. And this alliance basically forged a theocratic state. Religion and political power became, well, deeply intertwined.
Okay.
Now, this is where it gets complicated and, frankly, quite controversial, according to some analyses.
Oh, so?
Well, the argument is that certain interpretations, certain strands within Wahhabism have been linked, sometimes indirectly, sometimes maybe more directly, to the rise of radical ideologies.
Yeah.
The kind that feed into narratives around global terrorism.
That's a heavy implication. And it sits strangely alongside this image of just incredible wealth, doesn't it? We hear figures like trillions in assets, maybe 15,000 royals.
It is a stark contrast. The scale of the wealth is just, well, staggering, really. And yes, it allows for these incredibly lavish lifestyles. We read about the super yachts, the gold-plated cars, huge estates all over the world.
Yeah.
But running alongside that, almost inseparable from it in many reports, are these persistent allegations of widespread corruption.
Right. Allegations about embezzlement, siphoning off oil money for personal gain. It's a very different narrative from the official one. How does that even work, potentially?
Well, pinning down specifics is obviously incredibly difficult given the lack of transparency.
Yeah, sure.
But the way the state is structured, with so much power concentrated at the top and, limited checks and balances compared to democratic systems, it creates an environment where these kinds of allegations can thrive and persist. The kind of accountability mechanisms you might expect elsewhere just aren't as strong. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's the real impact of all this alleged corruption on the average Saudi citizen?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Because you have this immense wealth concentrated in relatively few hands, but reports also consistently point to, well, significant economic challenges for many others.
Absolutely. Despite being one of the world's richest countries in terms of oil, a substantial part of the Saudi population reportedly struggles. We hear about poverty, problems with housing, sometimes limited access to good health care or education. It's a real paradox.
And that leads us into another really difficult area, human rights. It seems like speaking out, criticizing the regime, that comes with enormous risks.
Yes. Sadly, the suppression of dissent is a theme that comes up again and again in the sources we looked at. Anyone seen as critical activists, journalists, academics, even clerics who don't toe the official line, they risk serious consequences. Imprisonment, often reports of torture, and in the most extreme cases, even execution.
The Jamal Khashoggi murder in 2018, that just brought it home in such a brutal, visceral way for the whole world.
It really did. What made the Khashoggi case so shocking, so globally resonant, wasn't just the, sheer brutality of it inside a consulate.
Right.
It was the credible evidence pointing towards the involvement of very high-ranking Saudi officials. Reports directly implicated Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. It became this horrifying example of just how far the state might go to silence someone perceived as an enemy, even abroad.
No, on the flip side, we have seen some changes, particularly regarding women. The ban on driving was lifted, for example.
Yeah.
How significant are those reforms? Are they fundamental shifts?
That's a good question. Look, the reforms allowing women to drive, to participate more visibly in public life, those are definitely notable changes, things that were unthinkable not long ago.
Yeah.
But it's important not to overstate it, perhaps. You have to look at the bigger picture. Major restrictions are still in place, especially because of the male guardianship system.
Explain that a bit.
Well, essentially it means women still need permission from a male relative, a father, husband, brother, sometimes even a son for major life decisions. Things like getting married, traveling abroad, sometimes accessing certain health care.
So progress, but within strict limits.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And then there's another massive human rights issue. The situation for millions of migrant workers under what's called the kafala system.
Right, the sponsorship system.
Exactly. It ties a worker's legal status directly to their employer. This gives the employer huge power, and unfortunately, human rights groups say it leads to widespread exploitation, unpaid wages, confiscated passports, terrible working conditions. Some have even likened it to modern slavery.
Wow. That's deeply concerning. It seems like it's not just external critics or internal dissenters causing friction. There are tensions within the royal family itself, right? It's not monolithic.
Oh, absolutely not. That's a very sharp point. The House of Saud is enormous, thousands of members, different branches, different lineages. And historically, there have always been rivalries, jockeying for power and influence between these factions. Sometimes it spills out into the open.
Like the Ritz-Carlton episode.
Precisely. That 2017 crackdown was extraordinary. MBS consolidated his power by detaining hundreds of prominent figures, princes, ministers, businessmen in the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton Hotel.
Right.
Officially, it was an anti-corruption drive, but many observers saw it as a, pretty ruthless power play to remove potential rivals and centralize control under him.
It sounds almost like something from a movie, detaining rivals in a luxury hotel. And what about royals who've left the country? Those in exile?
Yes, there are figures, members of the family, who live abroad now and are quite outspoken critics. They often raise issues like corruption, human rights abuses.
Do they have much impact?
It's debatable. They certainly face risks, potential threats. And their ability to genuinely influence things back inside the kingdom from exile, well, that's pretty limited, most likely.
Okay, shifting gears a bit to the global stage. Saudi Arabia's oil wealth obviously gives it huge geopolitical clout.
Undeniable. Being one of the world's top oil producers gives them massive leverage. They can and have influenced global energy markets, which in turn affects economies and politics worldwide. Adjusting oil production levels is a powerful tool.
And then there's that really thorny issue we touched on earlier, that the alleged funding of extremist ideologies globally, the government denies it, but the accusations persist.
It's incredibly contentious. The official line is a firm denial of any state support for terrorism, but critics consistently point to decades of funding for certain Wahhabi institutions, mosques, schools, charities around the world. The argument isn't always that they intended to fund violence, but that specific ultra-conservative interpretations promoted by these institutions have, unfortunately, been linked to extremist groups.
Right.
You often hear references to leaked documents or intelligence reports in these discussions, though, again, the Saudi government disputes their validity or interpretation. It's very complex, very murky.
And another major international issue has been the war in Yemen. That intervention has drawn widespread criticism.
Yes, the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen has led to what the UN consistently calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
Just devastating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thousands upon thousands of civilian deaths, many from coalition airstrikes. Widespread famine, cholera outbreaks. It's a catastrophe. And Saudi Arabia says sees serious accusations of potential war crimes from international human rights organizations.
Bringing it back inside the kingdom, how does the government manage information, control the narrative?
With a very tight grip.
Right.
State control over the media is extensive. Censorship is the norm. Critical voices are systematically suppressed. There's a huge effort, especially under MBS, to project this specific image of modernization, progress, openness.
Like the Vision 2030 plan?
Exactly. And alongside traditional censorship, there are numerous reports about the use of sophisticated digital tools. Cyber espionage, spyware allegedly used to monitor dissidents, activists, journalists, both inside Saudi Arabia and even those living abroad.
So this Vision 2030, the big economic and social reform plan under MBS, it sounds ambitious, but how's it viewed? Is it genuine transformation or something else?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it? The goals are certainly ambitious, diversifying the economy away from oil, modernizing society.
Right.
And some observers do see it as a genuine, necessary push towards reform, opening up the country, creating opportunities. But others are much more skeptical. They argue it's partly a PR exercise, a way to improve the kingdom's image internationally and consolidate MBS's own power, while the fundamental structures of repression, remain largely intact. A facade, essentially.
And introducing things like cinemas, concerts, big entertainment events that must clash with the deep-seated religious conservatism.
Oh, absolutely. It creates significant tension. For decades, that kind of entertainment was strictly forbidden under the prevailing religious influence. So bringing it in so rapidly alongside promoting tourism. It's a huge cultural shift, and it definitely creates friction and unease among more conservative segments of society. It raises big questions about the long-term social fabric.
Despite all these controversies, Khashoggi, Yemen, human rights concerns, major Western powers still seem to maintain pretty close ties, especially selling arms.
That really highlights a central tension in international relations, doesn't it?
It seems so.
You have countries like the US, the UK, France, expressing concern about human rights on one hand, but continuing multi-billion-dollar arms deals with Saudi Arabia on the other.
Why?
Well, it's a complex mix. Strategic alliances, regional stability concerns or perceptions of it, counterterrorism cooperation, and of course, huge economic interest. Jobs tied to those arms sales, Saudi investments.
Right.
So, while incidents like Khashoggi's murder or the horrors in Yemen do cause strain, maybe lead to some temporary condemnations or pauses. Often it seems those strategic and economic factors tend to win out in the long run.
So wrapping this up, after digging into these different reports and analyses, what's the main takeaway? It feels like a picture full of contradictions.
I think that's exactly it. The key takeaway is probably the stark contrast. You have this immense power, this almost unimaginable wealth, this projection of control and modernization. And right alongside it, beneath that surface, you have persistent issues. Serious human rights abuses, allegations of corruption, internal power struggles, controversial foreign interventions, and the suppression of dissent. The public image is carefully managed, but these underlying tensions and, well, secrets are very much part of the reality.
It really makes you think. Considering Saudi Arabia's global influence, its economic weight, its role in energy markets, what are the wider implications of these darker aspects we've talked about? It certainly leaves you pondering the complex ethics of global politics and how nations balance values against interest.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the story of Yasser Arafat. I mean, a figure who undeniably shaped the modern Middle East, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Leader of the PLO for, well, decades. An icon for so many. A real symbol of the Palestinian struggle.
But, you know, what happens when we look a bit deeper, beyond the, let's say, the standard narrative?
That's what we're doing today. Our mission really is to explore some of the more, well, surprising and complex sides of his leadership.
We're drawing on historical accounts, news analyses, quite a range of things. So if you're looking to get informed, quickly, but also thoroughly, you're definitely in the right place.
Yeah, and we've uncovered some fascinating, maybe even unsettling facts to unpack.
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it, how someone so prominent can still have so many layers that, well, maybe aren't often talked about.
Exactly. And what the sources we looked at reveal is a leader who operated with a really striking degree of strategic complexity. Understanding these nuances is, frankly, crucial to understanding the path of the Palestinian movement.
Okay, so let's start near the beginning.
Yeah.
Our sources generally point to Arafat being born in Cairo, Egypt, back in 1929. Though, interestingly, even his exact birthplace is sometimes disputed.
Right, but what's not disputed, what's really undeniable, is his early and, well, profound connection to the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, this wasn't just a passing interest for him. It was a lifelong dedication, apparently right from a very young age.
And that early commitment, it was clearly a driving force. A really key moment was his co-founding of Fatah.
Ah, Fatah, right.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that Fatah's core idea, it really centered on Palestinian self-determination achieved through their own efforts. Primarily, armed struggle.
So less reliance on other Arab nations.
Kind of. This focus on direct action rather than just, say, relying solely on pan-Arab unity. That was a big factor in them eventually taking the lead within the broader PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Which brings us neatly to 1969, a pretty pivotal year. Arafat becomes chairman of the PLO.
And this wasn't just some symbolic title, was it?
Not at all. It gave him immense authority over, well, practically all aspects of Palestinian affairs. He became the central figure, the voice, the ultimate decision maker for this movement with huge global implications.
And right here, this is where we really start to see that fascinating duality in his leadership emerge,
How so?
Well, publicly, he was the unwavering advocate for liberation, powerful speeches, rallying international support, that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah.
But at the same time, the sources we've looked at, they point to this complex web of clandestine negotiations and alliances, relationships that, frankly, often didn't quite match up with his public statements.
Right. This is where it gets really, really interesting. These often contradictory relationships he had with key Arab leaders.
We're talking big names here.
Yeah, figures like King Hussein of Jordan, Hafez al-Assad of Syria, even Saddam Hussein over in Iraq.
You'd maybe assume straightforward alliances or clear opposition, right?
Exactly. But with Arafat, it seems it was often a much more intricate dance. He readily accepted financial and military aid from these regimes, which, on the surface makes perfect sense for a liberation movement needing resources.
Totally. However, the evidence really suggests these relationships weren't built on, let's say, steadfast loyalty.
Meaning?
Well, when Arafat's own objectives clashed with the interests of these leaders, he wasn't shy about acting against them.
Ah, okay. A pragmatic approach, maybe?
You could call it that. Pragmatic, yes, and perhaps a necessity in the, volatile regional politics. But it also definitely cultivated deep-seated distrust.
And arguably limited the chance for consistent long-term support from these powerful neighbors.
Exactly. This pattern of prioritizing maybe immediate tactical gains sometimes seemed to come at the expense of building those stronger, more enduring alliances.
And this complexity, it really comes into sharp focus during events like the Lebanese Civil War.
Oh, yeah. The PLO's involvement there, it's documented as significantly intensifying an already incredibly volatile situation.
Their military operations drew considerable criticism, didn't they?
They did, from various factions within Lebanon itself and further afield, too.
And then, of course, there's Black September, Jordan, 1970.
Right. A brutal crackdown and ultimately the expulsion of PLO fighters by King Hussein.
And what's striking in some of the historical accounts is the suggestion that Arafat maybe significantly underestimated King Hussein's resolve, his willingness to use force.
That miscalculation, if that's what it was, had absolutely devastating consequences for the Palestinian community in Jordan, and, well, it led directly to the PLO being driven out of the country.
So alongside this image of the revolutionary icon, we start seeing these controversial decisions, these potential misjudgments stacking up.
And one of the most significant areas of controversy, it has to be said, involves the allegations of corruption and financial mismanagement.
Yeah, our sources detail pretty widespread claims of misuse of PLO funds, all under Arafat's direct control. We're talking potentially billions of dollars in donations and aid over the years.
And what's particularly notable, really, are the reports of secret bank accounts held in his name, supposedly containing hundreds of millions of dollars.
Wow. And these funds were allegedly used for what? Personal gain? Or securing loyalty?
Both, according to the allegations. Used for personal benefit or strategically to secure the loyalty of key figures within his inner circle. This creates a really stark and, frankly, uncomfortable contrast.
A really jarring contrast, as you say. You have Arafat living in, well, relative comfort, while a huge portion of the Palestinian population was enduring incredibly harsh economic conditions. The accusations, they paint a picture of a leader who might have prioritized his personal wealth and maybe his political survival, possibly at the expense of the very people he was supposed to be representing.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the internal dynamics and the huge challenges of maintaining accountability within such a long-standing liberation movement.
Yeah, it certainly raises fundamental questions about leadership in those kinds of struggles. How do leaders navigate the complexities of, funding, accountability, and keeping the trust of their people over decades of conflict?
It's a massive challenge.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's turn to a major turning point. The 1993 Oslo Accords, signed with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
A huge moment, yeah. On the surface, this looked like a monumental step towards peace, right? A framework for a potential Palestinian state.
And Arafat publicly presented it as just that, a significant achievement, a major step on the long road towards self-determination.
However, behind the scenes, the reaction was far from unified.
Right. Our sources reveal a really significant and quite vocal backlash from within the PLO itself, and also from groups like Hamas.
They felt he'd made substantial, unacceptable concessions, basically that he'd compromised on fundamental Palestinian demands. Betrayal, some called it.
And it gets even more complicated, doesn't it? There are these persistent reports suggesting Arafat made other undisclosed concessions to Israeli and American officials during those very delicate negotiations.
Which understandably fueled even greater suspicion among many Palestinians. It created this deep sense of unease, a feeling that, the full picture wasn't being shared.
And if we look at how things played out historically, the fact that key goals of Oslo, especially the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state, ultimately didn't happen.
Yeah, that raises serious questions, doesn't it, about the effectiveness of the Accords themselves and, critically, Arafat's role in their eventual stagnation.
Critics argue his inability or maybe unwillingness to fully implement certain parts or enforce the agreed-upon terms contributed significantly to that failure.
It's a key point of debate, for sure.
Then fast forward a bit, we have the Second Intifada, kicked off in 2000.
Right. And our sources suggest a notable shift in Arafat's approach during this period.
How so? Because publicly, he was condemning violence against Israeli civilians, wasn't he?
He was publicly condemning it. But at the same time, there's evidence indicating his private support for armed factions, groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades.
Really? What kind of evidence?
Well, leaked documents, intelligence reports, they reportedly show Arafat authorizing the transfer of funds to these militant groups.
Which definitely complicates the narrative of him just being a peacemaker.
It absolutely does. It suggests a more multifaceted strategy, perhaps even contradictory, maybe aimed at exerting pressure through, well, various means, including violence.
And then in 2004, Arafat dies. And the circumstances around his death, they remain a subject of really intense debate, even today.
Yeah, the official cause was reported as a stroke resulting from a blood disorder, but suspicions of foul play have persisted ever since.
What fuels those suspicions mainly?
Well, what's particularly intriguing is the discovery back in 2012, traces of polonium-210, which is a highly radioactive substance found on his personal belongings by forensic experts.
Polonium, that's serious.
Very serious. Now, definitive proof of poisoning, it remains elusive, and it's contested. But that discovery undoubtedly reinforced the belief for many, many Palestinians that he was assassinated.
Possibly by external actors, foreign intelligence agencies, that sort of thing.
That's the prevailing theory among those who believe he was poisoned, yes.
And his death, as you kind of alluded to earlier, it created a significant power vacuum within the PLO, didn't it?
It really did. Led to internal divisions, further highlighting the intricate and often contentious dynamics of Palestinian leadership that existed even before he died.
So when we try to sum up Arafat's legacy, it's just far from a simple picture, isn't it?
Not simple at all. He is simultaneously remembered as this heroic figure, right? An enduring symbol of Palestinian resistance and that long, long struggle for self-determination.
But on the other hand, the sources we've examined present a pretty compelling case for a more, well, flawed leader.
Flawed, yeah. Someone whose decisions, the secret alliances, the alleged financial issues, the shifting strategies may have ultimately hindered the very cause he championed his whole life.
It really challenges you, the listener, to try and reconcile these completely contrasting perspectives.
Precisely. And gaining an understanding of these less visible aspects, these complexities and contradictions, it offers a much more nuanced and I think ultimately more valuable insight into this pivotal figure and, by extension, into the ongoing history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So as you reflect on Yasser Arafat, maybe consider how these hidden dealings, the accusations of deception, the internal power struggles, how might they shape your understanding of the current landscape, the landscape of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the continued pursuit of self-determination?
It's such a complex and, frankly, often tragic history. And Arafat's story is, well, a powerful illustration of just how complex it all is.
Absolutely. We really encourage you to continue exploring the historical context and the many, many different perspectives on this truly consequential. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really disturbing. The alleged use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. We're going to try and unpack the secrets, the accountability questions, the cover-ups, and really the human cost.
Which is immense.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've looked at a whole range of sources: history, international investigations, survivor stories.
Yeah, a broad spectrum.
Our goal isn't just the headlines. We want to get into the nuances, maybe understand the why behind it all.
And that context is just so vital here. We're talking about alleged actions inside this devastating civil war.
Right.
And these allegations, they have huge implications for how the world sees and, well, responds to these kinds of atrocities.
Okay, let's start back at the beginning then. Bashar al-Assad, he takes power in 2000, right, after his father Hafez ruled for decades.
Correct.
And there was this initial feeling, wasn't there, that he might be different, a reformer maybe?
There definitely was that image pushed, yeah. Talk of modernization, opening things up a bit.
But that didn't really last, did it?
Well, looking back, you can see signs pretty early on. His appointments, some decrees, they hinted that consolidating power, his own and his inner circles, like his brother Mar, was the real game plan.
Through suppression.
Exactly. Suppression, intimidation. It kind of laid the groundwork, this authoritarian foundation for what came later.
Which brings us to 2011, the Arab Spring. Protests kick off in Syria, calling for reforms.
And they escalate fast, very fast, into full-blown civil war.
How did the regime's first reaction to those protests set the stage for the chemical weapons allegations later?
The response to the initial peaceful protests was just incredibly brutal, excessive force right from the start.
No engagement.
No, it was a violent crackdown, military force against civilians, and that violence, it didn't just fuel the war's escalation.
It showed a willingness.
Exactly, a willingness to use unrestrained force against their own people. It's a terrible precedent, and arguably, it made using chemical weapons seem like a possible, though obviously horrifying, next step to keep control.
Then we get to 2013, Ghouta. That name just instantly means horror.
It does.
Can you walk us through what happened? Why was it such a turning point?
August 2013, Ghouta. The evidence points overwhelmingly to sarin gas.
Sarin, nerve agent.
Yes, delivered by rockets. The result, hundreds dead, civilians, so many children, the sheer scale.
And the images were just
unbelievable. Eyewitness accounts, video, choking, convulsions. Hospitals completely overwhelmed. It was shocking. It definitely grabbed the world's attention. Even if the follow-through was limited.
Right, the international response. It was messy.
Understatement.
You had UN investigations suggesting the regime was responsible, Syria denying everything, and then Obama's red line.
That infamous red line on chemical weapons.
Yeah.
The UN investigations did present compelling evidence, according to many experts, but Syria and Russia just dismissed it.
So the expectation was U.S. military action.
It seemed that way, but it was averted. Russia stepped in, brokered a deal.
The deal for Syria to give up its chemical weapons stockpile?
Exactly. Syria agreed to declare and surrender its arsenal. It was hailed by some as diplomacy working, but critics argued it let the regime off the hook, avoided real accountability, and maybe, just maybe, allowed them to hide some of their capabilities.
Because the attacks didn't stop.
No, they didn't. Which leads us to the next phase.
After 2013, the reports shift. More about chlorine gas now, often in barrel bombs.
That's right.
Why the change? And what was the effect of these attacks?
Well, chlorine, it's still a banned chemical weapon, let's be clear. But it's not a nerve agent like sarin. Less instantly lethal on a mass scale, perhaps.
So why use it?
Several possible reasons. Maybe they still had easier access to chlorine or its precursors. Maybe they calculated cynically that it wouldn't trigger the same level of international outrage as sarin did.
Less likely to cross that red line again.
Perhaps. But make no mistake, these chlorine attacks, often from crude barrel bombs just rolled out of helicopters, they were devastating.
How so?
Horrific injuries, severe breathing problems, chemical burns. And the psychological impact, living under the constant fear of these indiscriminate attacks falling from the sky, it became this terrifying reality in opposition areas.
Do we have specific examples?
Oh, absolutely. Places like Duma, Conchikun, Latamina, numerous documented attacks. We have testimony from survivors, from doctors, describing the choking, the burning lungs, the long-term health effects, too.
So amid these ongoing attacks, how did the world try to investigate? That's the OPCW's job, right? Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Yes, the OPCW is the main international body for this. But their work in Syria has been incredibly difficult.
How so? What challenges did they face?
Huge challenges. Getting access to attack sites often involved massive delays. There were serious security risks for the inspectors on the ground.
And obstruction.
And outright obstruction from the Syrian government, yes. Despite all that, the OPCW did produce reports. And many of them pointed the finger squarely at Assad's forces for multiple attacks.
But Syria and Russia just deny it all.
Consistently, they claim the evidence is fabricated or that rebels staged the attacks. It's a constant refrain.
And this plays out at the UN, too.
Definitely. At the UN Security Council, Russia primarily has used its veto power again and again to block resolutions that would hold Syria accountable for using chemical weapons.
Veto power. That's the 5 permanent members, right? China, France, Russia, UK, US.
Correct. Any one of them can block a resolution, and Russia's protection has been absolutely key for Assad.
It's easy to get sort of bogged down in the geopolitics, the acronyms.
It is.
But we need to remember the human cost. Let's bring it back to the people, the victims.
Yeah, absolutely essential. Because behind every allegation, every report, there are real people suffering unimaginable things.
What does that look like on the ground?
It looks like survivors living with chronic health problems, breathing difficulties, skin conditions. Years later, it's families mourning loved ones killed in the most horrific ways.
And the medics.
Medics working in bombed-out clinics with almost no supplies, trying to treat victims while sometimes becoming victims themselves. The psychological trauma is immense, too, living with that constant fear. It scars entire communities.
Children especially.
Children have suffered terribly, orphaned, disabled, their lives just shattered. And you have to remember, hospitals and clinics were often deliberately targeted in Syria, making it even harder to get help for anything, let alone a chemical attack.
And while all this is happening, the Assad regime is actively denying it, pushing counter-narratives.
Very actively. It's a pretty sophisticated denial and disinformation strategy.
What does that involve?
State media constantly pumps out stories blaming rebel groups, saying they staged the attacks to frame the government. Or they just deny the attacks happened at all.
And they target groups like the White Helmets.
Yes, there's been a persistent campaign trying to discredit the White Helmets, the volunteer rescue workers claiming they faked evidence or even carried out attacks. Completely baseless, but persistent.
And social media plays a role.
A big role. Pro-regime accounts, probably state-backed trolls too, spread these narratives online, muddying the waters, trying to create doubt about what actually happened.
So you have all this evidence, UN reports, OPCW findings, survivor testimony, yet real accountability seems so far off. Why? What's blocking the path to justice?
It's a frustrating mix of things. Geopolitics is huge. Russia and Iran's unwavering support for Assad shields him politically and militarily. That makes action through channels like the UN Security Council basically impossible.
But there are other routes. Legal routes.
Human rights groups are trying. They're pushing cases in European courts using universal jurisdiction.
Universal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
That's where courts can prosecute certain major crimes like war crimes, even if they happen elsewhere.
Exactly. It allows prosecution regardless of where the crime occurred or the nationality of perpetrators or victims. But these cases are incredibly complex. They take years and face huge legal hurdles.
So overall, the international response has been lacking.
Largely, yes. There hasn't been a unified, decisive response strong enough to enforce accountability. Which leads to a really disturbing question.
Which is?
Has the world, maybe without intending to, started to normalize the use of chemical weapons in some situations by failing to act decisively here?
That's a chilling thought. And beyond the lack of justice, what's the long-term legacy of all this alleged chemical warfare in Syria?
It's multifaceted and deeply concerning. Environmentally, you have potential contamination of land, water, which could mean future health crises.
And for warfare itself.
Arguably, it's eroded the global taboo against chemical weapons, that long-standing norm, that prohibition. It feels weaker now. It could make their use seem more possible, more thinkable in future conflicts, which is incredibly dangerous.
And for Syrian society.
The deepest scars are there, the trauma, the mistrust, the sheer challenge of rebuilding lives and communities after experiencing this kind of horror. It's immense.
So looking forward now. The conflict isn't over. Assad is still in power. Are there still efforts to deal with the chemical weapons issue, to get justice?
The immediate global spotlight might have dimmed a bit, with other crises flaring up. But yes, work continues. Documenting evidence, legal efforts, diplomatic discussions, they haven't stopped entirely.
And what are the big lessons here? What should the world learn from this?
Oh, some hard lessons. It shows how fragile international norms are when powerful states decide to ignore them or protect those who do. It highlights just how difficult accountability is during active conflict.
And the need for
a much stronger, more unified international will to enforce the rules, to act decisively when chemical weapons are used, regardless of the political complexities. Preventing this from becoming normal requires real commitment to international law, real consequences for perpetrators.
This has been a really sobering deep dive into these deeply troubling allegations about chemical weapons in Syria. We've covered Assad's rise, the horrific attacks like Ghouta, the shift to chlorine, the maze of investigations.
The denials, the disinformation.
And above all, the human cost. The key takeaways are pretty stark, aren't they? Repeated alleged use of banned weapons, a complicated, often gridlocked international response, accountability proving incredibly elusive.
And just profound, lasting suffering for the Syrian people.
It leaves us with a final, unsettling question, I think. When you see these alleged atrocities, and the world struggles so much to deliver justice, what does that tell us about the future of international law, about our collective ability to stop chemical warfare from becoming just another tactic.
A question that demands reflection.
It really does. Something for all of us and for you listening to keep thinking about. Thank you for joining us.